How's everyone doing? It's a packed house. Thanks for coming. Really appreciate it. We'll get started with our intros now.
I'm Megan Pekarek. I'm a front-end developer here at Livefront, or not here, but at Livefront.
And I'm Ben Wood. I'm the creative director at Livefront. We've been building products together for about 2 years now, but we've never had a chance to work on something from the start. We both inherited a project, an iterative project that has been in progress for years. So we wanted to try something different out and see if we could find some new ways to work together in the future. So our goal, what we were looking to accomplish, was really to take some of the guesswork out of the responsive behavior. That's something that we hear from dev as a design team quite often of, what is this supposed to look like in between those breakpoints that you have designed, mobile and tablet and desktop. We wanted to just overall improve the design and dev handoff process. Make the Figma file structure easier to navigate and more intuitive. That's another question that we get, I think, quite often is, where's this thing? I know it's here. I have a ticket for it, but where is it? And finally, just improve communication between the two of us. So to do that, we had to create something from scratch with very little time and no ideas. We went to ChatGPT and decided to let them pick out a website that we could design together. And they came up with a bookstore for conspiracy theorists. Without very much more thought, we just kind of dove into it. I have to admit, I got a little carried away with designing book covers, going into Midjourney and Photoshop and putting these together. And it's the tiniest detail that once you get to the site, you're not even going to notice them. So I made this slide just so that I could show these off. That's probably about 30 minutes per second that's up on the screen. So thanks for looking. And introducing the tinfoil hat. This is our company. Really wanted to do something very simple. So zoom back out here, and we'll just do a quick rundown again because we were creating this just as an experiment and really dealing with process. There's nothing too crazy going on here. You have a pretty simple hero image. You got one input field, a scrolling banner that isn't terribly accessible, and I would never do it in real life, but I got to do it here. Some new arrivals. And then we get down into Rick's picks. He has some suggestions for us all, and finally a global footer. So this is what it looks like in Figma. Of course, with Figma, it's not real, just like the moon landing, right? And it's not real until Megan gets her hands on it. So I will hand it off to Megan, and she will talk through this.
Yeah, so here's what we ended up with. So hopefully you guys think it looks pretty close. I think it looks pretty close. We had some fun, or I had some fun building this. But yeah, so got Rick's picks there, the whole thing. But today, what we're going to go through for the agenda is first we're going to talk about the general approach, so how we went about designing and planning to develop this, and then second we're going to go through the file and folder structure that we landed on for this project, both in the Figma file and in the code base. And then 3 and 4, we're going to go through and tell you how both Ben and me made sure that we're only using colors and typography from the global style guide. And then number 5, we're going to talk about the grid system that Ben used in Figma and then the one that I used in the code base. And then lastly, we're going to walk you through how we built components and what that process looked like.
Yeah, so we'll start with general approach, and general approach is just something that we were looking at as we started, what was going to be the basis of this experiment, really, that we were doing together. Is everyone familiar with Brad Frost? Show of hands. He's been around for a while. He's an OG. In 2013, he published a book called Atomic Design, and he's been working on design systems as a consultant ever since then. Does a lot of speaking, a lot of writing. The other thing that he's worked on is something called the hot potato process. So we're all familiar with waterfall. It is the very linear sequential approach that basically says we're going to figure it all out in the beginning and nothing's ever going to change. The requirements don't change, the user's needs don't change, and then we're just going to build it and we're going to leave it. The hot potato process looks a little bit more like this, where we're in constant communication between design and development and handing it back and forth. In actuality, it ended up looking a little bit more like this. It was a little bit dev heavy. I did a lot of the work up front, and we still got to, I think, use a lot of the techniques that were talked about within hot potato process, but it wasn't necessarily as rapid fire back and forth as I think we expected it to. It's a warm potato. It's a warm potato process. The atomic design system that I mentioned earlier, this is probably just a refresher for a lot of you. It's a way of breaking down the way you design and build a website into multiple components. So you have atoms that will load here, and atoms are really the basic building blocks of your UI. So you have a label, you have a button, you have an input field, and those combine to make up molecules like this search bar here that includes those three atoms. Molecules are added to other molecules and also atoms to become organisms, which then get built together to make templates, which are really the pages but without real content. And then finally you get a real page, which is when the content has been added. Atomic design system, I love it. I've been using it for a long time. The issue with it is that in the Venn diagram of UX designers and molecular chemists, there's not a lot of overlap, and it leads to designers asking a lot of questions of like, is this an atom? Is this a molecule? So even though we took the approach of atomic design, we ended up changing a lot of the labels, and I'll hand off to Megan to talk more about that.
Yeah, so the file and folder structure that we landed on is actually, so Ben and I work on a client project together right now, and so what we used is just what we are using on the code base side, for the web at least. That's what we use for both my side and his side, because I won that battle. Developers tend to be kind of whiny about the atomic process, so here we are. So first we went with blocks. This is things like cards, or in our case, a book pick or a book card. And then next is elements, or I want to go back to blocks really quick. Blocks are things that are reused, but they're not on every page, and they're not native HTML elements that we've redesigned. They're just little chunks of code. Next we have elements, and these are usually native HTML elements that we have redesigned. So our button and input field component lived here. And then next we have infrastructure, and this is where things show up that are on every page. So our header and footer lived in this folder. And then next we have our pages, and since this was just one page, our home page got this all to itself. So this is the structure that we landed on, Figma versus code, and this was really awesome for me because, like Ben said, I am lost in the design file a lot, but this felt just like home. But I do want to say, something that weird that we had to do on Figma is Figma does not allow folders. Like, you can't make a folder. So what we did over there, so that components file you see, one that's just an empty file that's called components, and then right beneath it is blocks, and that's on the same level as components, but the name of that file is it just has spaces in front of it and an emoji. It took me a long time to figure that out. I was like, Ben, how are you making these? I don't know what's going on. So finally figured that out, and we wish that Figma had folders for sure, but we'll get into that later.
Yeah, we wish Figma did a lot of things.
Yeah, we'll get into our complaints section in a bit. But yeah, so for the most part, they're pretty much identical. There's a couple components that I had on my side that didn't make sense for Ben. I had to make a component for that blackout text, and didn't make sense for him to do that. And then the other one is my grid overlay component, which I will get into later. And then next we have our assets folder. This is the exact same on either side, and this was really great for me because on the client project we're on right now, we have a couple of different places where we put our assets depending on where they go, and I always feel like I'm always like, where do I put this? And now I put it where Ben tells me to, and it was great. And now then we have our styles folder, and so this one, as you can see, I have more files than Ben as well because some of those didn't make sense for him, but everything that he has on his side, I have on mine.
So now we get into colors. I will say a caveat. This is not the way you should do it. We took a page from material. If you do it this way, that's fine. We have a different approach. But at the top here, you see the core colors of our palette. And then each of those core colors is marked as a 500 level. And then tints of shades are given other numbers so that you have a full range of tints and shades of each of those main colors. Why I say don't do it this way, I think it is much more valuable to have colors named by their usage, so that if you decide to make body copy instead of, say, neutral 700, you want it to be neutral 500, you don't have to hunt down every piece of body copy and change it one by one. If you just have a body copy color, you might know in the back of your mind that it's neutral 500, and that's enough for the system to make a global change, the system being Figma.
Yeah, and on our side, we have a similar strategy. So here I have all of the color palette colors. And then, like Ben said, every single one of those main color palette colors has a bunch of different shades. So I didn't add every single one. I just added them as we were using them. And so, yeah, these are just the main colors. I never use hard-coded hex anywhere in the code base to make sure that we're only using the colors from the theme. But we actually have a similar strategy to what Ben uses, where we will have little named colors like this so that if Ben says, hey, we want to change the color of the body text, I can change it in one place. I don't have to hunt down every place that we're setting that. But I will confess, in this small project, I did use some of the brand colors. But on our client project, we never use any of the brand colors. We only use our second layer.
So when we get into typography, I don't have a lot to say about typography other than this is it. The one thing that I do want to point out is that everything in the design, because everything in the code will have a designated style, we want to make sure that's also happening on the Figma side. So every piece of text that you're going to see on the tinfoil hat has been assigned one of these values.
Yeah, and then on our side, what I did is I created a mix-in for every single one of the typography styles that Ben added to the global library. And then if I'm ever setting any type of font style, I'm always using a mix-in. I'm never setting a random font size or anything like that. And then just to get into the Mixin code, I just kind of wanted to explain what we're doing here. What we do is we try to set all of our mobile styles by default to because we have a mobile-first mindset whenever we're doing styling. So on the left, that's something that's in the Figma file. So the top level is the mobile font for a heading 2, and then the bottom one is for desktop. So for our styles in the Mixin, we have our size 36 of font size, and then 42 pixel line height, and then negative 1.5% of letter spacing. And then for desktop, we only have to override the font size of 48 and the line height of 56 because it's the only thing that changes. And then another thing I wanted to point out is this REM function that you'll see a lot of in our CSS. We use this in our client project. We try to use REM units so that as users expand their text for accessibility reasons or whatever reason, everything expands as it should, so that versus pixels where that does not happen. So we don't want to have to look at the design and have to convert it to REMs in our head, so we just wrap whatever pixel is in the design in this function and use that everywhere.
Now we get into grid systems. I love grid systems. I'm also a dinosaur, so we can debate this later if we want to, but I think that the grid is really great, especially for setting up responsive behaviors on the design side. I think if you're making a design, especially a responsive web design without a grid, basically what you're doing is you're picking the widths of, say, a multi-column element arbitrarily based on how it looks with the copy that you have on the screen at that certain breakpoint. When you're using a grid, you define it by the number of columns, and it takes some of that guesswork out of it, and you're not nudging pixels. You're really just selecting how many columns you want to use. So that speaks to the general lack of exactness. You also don't have to guess how elements should be spaced within those screens. We know that it can be static because we defined it as static when we create the grid in the beginning of the project.
So some problems that are out there. So Ben loves using it on his side. That rocks for him. But sometimes we have hard times with grid frameworks on the development side. And one of the issues with that, and a common one, is Bootstrap. It comes with a lot of styles, or at least a little bit of styling for most grid frameworks, and we end up having to override them because those aren't our styles. It's not what we want to use. And so then the CSS that is creating those styles oftentimes just sits there going to waste because we're just overriding it every time. And then lastly, we can just never be sure that whatever framework we choose is going to be maintained. So for this project, I wanted to try and build a grid system with CSS and see if it actually helped me in the development process. And some things I liked about it is I had full control over all of the CSS. I knew exactly what was in there. And then I also was able to create an overlay component that just sat over whatever I was creating, and I could just make sure that whatever component I was looking at was taking up the correct amount of columns at every breakpoint. And then I also have the ability to add different grid margins, gutters, columns, things like that if Ben says that he wants to change something about the grid he's using for whatever breakpoint.
So creating a grid in Figma is really easy. You can see over here on the right-hand side, you just have the number of columns. It's always 12 on desktop, 12, 6 on tablet. Within that, you have some ability to change some things. You can have it take up the full width. There are some hacky pieces to it. You can't set a max width, for example, in Figma. So we played with the margins at 120, which wouldn't be the actual margins on the page, but for the breakpoint or the viewport that we're designing in, 120 was going to get us to the max width. Then you're able to set your gutters, so 32 is going to be our standard, and then the columns are going to flex to match that.
Yep, and then on the development side, the photo to the left is what the overlay looks like for me when I'm checking my work. But we have, for a grid desktop, for example, we have I'm passing in 12 there for 12 columns, and then 32 for a 32 pixel gutter. And then you can see that my tablet grid is using 100% width and just subtracting whatever margins Ben wants on the side of there. And then our desktop is using that hard max width of 160 that he has.
On mobile, it's not too different because it's smaller screen, less screen real estate. We've taken the columns down to 2 and the gutters down to 24, and that's it.
Yep, and then mobile for us, we're doing the same thing as tablet, where it's 100% minus whatever mobile grid margin, and then we're passing in 2 columns, and then the 24 pixel gutter. So talk a little bit more about this CSS Grid. I tried to keep the Bootstrap classes. I worked with Bootstrap a few years ago, so they were pretty familiar to me. But so this is on the left is, left for you guys too. On the left is an example of something with all of my grid classes in it. So the container is row container, which does exactly what you think. It contains all of the rows. There's usually one of these for each section on the page, and then within there, it's however many rows you want. And then you can see the 3 divs within there. I'll have a call class on there, and I can set for whatever breakpoint how many columns I want it to take up. So in this example, each of those divs would take up 4 columns each on desktop, 3 columns each on tablet, and 2 columns each on mobile, which is the full width. And then you can see my row container CSS to the right. That's just saying takes up 100% of the width. It centers everything. And then you can see it's adding the mobile grid that I set for the mobile breakpoint, tablet for tablet, and desktop for desktop. And then I just briefly want to talk about the grid overlay component because I had a lot of fun working with this. It was very satisfying. I was like, yes, hitting those designs. But pretty much what I'm doing is I have the row container like you saw before, and then I have a row in there. Well, the row container is a fixed height. I'll show you the CSS over here. The row container is fixed, so it just sits on top of everything that I'm creating, and then there's a row within there that is 100% of the height, and then each column within there just has the styling that Ben has for his so that it can match up. And so this is me playing with the grid overlay and making sure that those cards are going where they're supposed to be.
So now we get into the point where Megan is just going to talk for like 40 slides straight. Is that right?
I don't know how many. Okay. I don't know if I want to know how many.
Is that seat open, Nathan? You got this.
Okay. This was not planned. Okay, so now we're going to get into building components. So our goal for building components is we wanted to try and sync. I just realized you're supposed to talk a little bit in one of these, but we we want to try and sync our auto layout in Figma to our Flex displays in CSS, and we'll get into that in a little bit about what those two are. And then we also wanted to sync whatever variant names we have in Figma to our prop names in the code base. We wanted to communicate on what should and shouldn't be a component, and then use the same names for whatever components we decide on. Auto layout.
This is the part that I was supposed to talk about. So if you use Figma, you know what auto layout is. The things that we want to point out are some of the similarities that we have between what we're doing on the Figma side and then what ends up being in code. So if you hit the first button there, nope. That doesn't go forward. So one-dimensional layout, meaning that every auto layout is either going to be a horizontal row or a vertical column. Then we have the space between, and then padding around each side. It also offers space distribution and powerful alignment capabilities, which what we mean by that is, so in this example, if you see on the right in that grid there, everything is centered both vertically and horizontally within the frame, which is similar to what you do.
Yeah, so Flexbox has a similar idea. It's also a one-dimensional layout model, so you can either have the elements in a row or you can put them in a column, and then it offers a space distribution of elements. So for that first screenshot, that could have those ABC elements could be spread all the way apart. They could be centered toward the front of the container or the back of the container, and then powerful alignment capabilities. So if those were smaller, we could say if we wanted them to be centered at the top or at the bottom vertically. So with that being said, we iterated on a lot of components, and we had a lot of fun, I think, trying to make our components as similar as possible. But we wanted to go through this component specifically, our book pick component, because it had a lot of iterations, and I think we got to a good spot with it in the end. So this is what we started with. So Ben threw this component my way, and I was like, okay, this, you can't tell. So that title, that orange thing at the bottom is a thick orange line that is like a divider. And I was like, why is this a rectangle around the entire title? And it was kind of tucked behind the book. And I was like, okay, it's not in the auto layout. So my mind was like, I guess position absolute. We'll just throw it on there absolutely. And then I put it 50 pixels from the bottom. I wasn't sure if it was supposed to be centered between the title and the price or like what the deal was there. But I'm sure if a user would increase their font size, it would have been an absolute mess. So I was like, hey, Ben, do you mind if we put the title, the divider, and the price in an auto layout so that they can all just move as they will? But the only bummer is there's going to be this little gap between the divider and the book cover. And he's like, oh, yeah, that totally works. And actually, I know how to fix the gap. I will use a negative gap on the auto layout. But what he said in that time, he meant gap, but he said margin. And so I can't actually
Which is not
use...
correct.
I know, he was like, should we put that in there? And I'm like, absolutely, that's how I got there. But yeah, so he used a negative gap there to push them together so they're overlapping. So it looked great in the design. But I actually can't use a negative flex gap. But when he used the word margin, I was like, oh, I can put a negative margin on the first element in there, and it will have the same deal. It'll overlap, and everything will be fine. And then next, Ben was like, yeah, how great was that negative gap? And then I just put some right padding on the title to make sure the text doesn't overlap the book cover. And I was like, yeah, I thought of that too. And then I like quickly went over and I put the padding on my side. And so thank you, Ben. And then after that, the last iteration we had here was, I noticed that this title element was 55 pixels, and I wasn't going to fix the height, but I was like, okay, well, it's tall, so I'm just going to make it 60% of the height. And then I was like, why does this have a height on it at all? You know, can't it just grow with the text? And so I was like, Ben, do you mind if we just skip that, setting the height there? And he said, yeah. So he changed that to height hug, which is the same as our height auto. So I was able to just completely remove that height style. So what we ended up with, this is our final container element of the book pick component on my side. So it's display flex, which defaults to the row direction. And then Ben had the same deal. It's display row or auto layout horizontal version, but he did have the -8 gap on there that I couldn't put on mine. And then on my side, we ended up with, this is the book info, so the first element in the flex display or auto layout. I ended it with a flex direction of column. I'm justifying all of the elements toward the end of the container, and then there's a gap of 12 pixels between each of those, the title, divider, and the price. And then I had to add the margin right of -8 pixels. And then lastly, I had added the 4 pixel of padding on top, none on the sides, and then 8 pixel padding on the bottom. And then Ben ended up with something very similar for his book info container. It's a column or vertical auto layout. Everything is justified toward the bottom, just like me. Every element in there is 12 pixels apart. And then he also had the same padding, 4 on top, 8 on bottom, and none on the sides. So this is what we ended up with for our book pick final title. Very simple, just had that padding right of 8 pixels, and then Ben also had his 8 pixels of padding on there. So circling back to what we wanted to accomplish here, what we wanted to do was just take the guesswork out of our responsive behavior, which I feel like the grid really helped with, and a lot of other things. Improve the design and development process. Definitely feel like that improved. Figma file structure was an absolute breeze. That was awesome to work in. And then improved communication, which was great because we sat next to each other for most of it.
Yeah, one part that I forgot to talk about with the hot potato process is that the idea is that developers and designers do physically sit next to each other. Obviously, that's happening a lot less since that article came out in early 2020. But the way that Brad Frost recommends getting around that is just keeping an open Zoom link going for a few hours a day, so that you do have the ability to just shout out a question the same way you would if someone was sitting next to you and you could tap them on the shoulder. So some of the takeaways: hot potato process, mutually beneficial, worked great for both of us. The similar folder structure definitely increased dev efficiency, and by dev efficiency, not asking me questions about where things are. Learning how each other's builds things, I think, was really helpful in me understanding and building empathy for how Megan was putting things together. Helped me build my components better from the beginning, so that we don't have to have this negotiation in the future, or at least that's the idea. As you know, what we're building becomes more complex, I'm sure we're going to have many more instances like the one we just went over with, where things get more complicated. But at least for right now, certainly within, I mean, we did this in a week, so saw great progress out of that week. The Megan didn't hate the grid, so that was cool.
No, I happened to really. I was like, "Do you want to put Megan loved the grid in there?" Because I thought I had a great time.
Yeah,
I was like, "This is so satisfying."
I've been trying to convince everyone to use grids for so long, and I think I'm finally making some progress.
Don't look
okay. Sitting next to each other while building the site made it easy to ask quick questions. And then Figma certainly has some improvements to make, speaking of. So we talked about the hack that we have for the collapsible nested folders. That's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, there's also a problem where you can do nesting within your styles, specifically type styles, by just setting up folders. But then when you go to select them within the input, the folder structure kind of disappears, or at least partially disappears. So hopefully they fix that soon. There is no max width or like fill until you hit max width option for horizontal resizing. Defining the width of a frame as a percentage, this is the one that I really feel is missing, especially when you're working with a grid framework. If I want to set something to 66%, I can type in 66% and it'll give me something back. But what it does is it does the math for you. It takes the fixed size of whatever the parent is and then says, okay, 66% of this is 200 pixels. But then you're locked in and it becomes a fixed width. And then finally, putting one component in each file or each page is probably not reasonable for larger projects until Figma implements that nested file structure that we talked about. So we have some time for some Q&A. Before we get to that, if you scan this QR code, you can take a look at the code base. You can get access to the Figma file. The slides are not on there yet because we were making changes up until like 15 minutes before the presentation, but they will be on there. And of course, always happy to connect with all of you on LinkedIn. Any questions? Yeah. No promo codes, but I could send you some like covers we could print out and wrap some books.
Yeah, so out of the 6 areas you guys went through, when was the potato the hottest? Was you building the components from the design?
Yeah, I would say that one component, the potato, was pretty hot. Mm-hmm. The rest of it was kind of warm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say making sure that the auto layout, at least what Figma was able to do, matches the code, was definitely the part that was the most collaborative, and probably the part where we learned the most through this process as well.
Yeah, I agree.
Peter?
An incredible amount of collaboration back and forth, but I'm not sure every designer developer is doing this. What would you say to designer developers to convince them to get this, to try this out, or how would you tell them to get started?
Yeah, so The way I look at the process that we use internally at Livefront, I treat it almost like a product that we're working on, where in this case, the developers are really my users. When I'm setting up a Figma file, I want to make sure that they are happy and satisfied with everything that goes on. So my encouragement for anyone that isn't doing this level of collaboration is not necessarily follow exactly what we did here, but start communicating with your developers. The best thing you can do as a designer is be the designer that every developer wants to work with, because you set up things right and easy and make their jobs easier.
Yeah, and on the development side, I will say, like, I thought it was so cool. Like, I don't know, I feel like I've never been in design and like had ideas about how to build things based off of the design, but it was really fun being in there and seeing how similar we could set them up and being like, oh, I'll build it. I don't know, I thought it was great. So I feel like that'd be my push for developers, to maybe nudge your designers a little bit, because it was fun. I think we both ended up with better things on either side.
For developers, what ways have you found helpful for the developers to learn navigating Figma as well as contributing into Figma? I think that'd be one of the difficulties my development team would have, is not necessarily having the right Figma training. Is there Figma training for developers you think is particularly useful, or other practices or strategies to sit together virtually that would help learn the tools?
Yeah, so I was graciously granted Figma access a couple months ago by my company, which was felt very VIP, but
Edit access.
edit access. Yeah, not obviously had Figma access before, but it's a lot to learn, I will say. I don't know if there's like anything specific that I can think about that would like be good for training, but just like one thing that was really fun with this is like I could go through, and so for example, his auto layout, one of the things wasn't named, like, and like why would he name it? It was just like a random element, but I was like, I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna name that book info because that's the class that I put on it. So it was really cool for me to be able to go in and put all of that, and it was super clear to me what was doing what, and I could kind of assign it. But that's not something that like is probably gonna happen that much in a client project. It was just something I got spoiled with on this random project we did. But I don't know. I think that like I would just say like if your developers can like edit access feels risky. Like even for me, I'm in there. I'm like, should I have access? What's going on here? But I don't know. Just like setting up the code base or the file base correctly, I think is almost enough. And then yeah, I would just like give the designers nudges for the most part.
Yeah, to add to that, it's a great question. It's actually one we're asking ourselves. There's an internal team working at Livefront right now on how to best document this as kind of a user guide that we can have in all of our Figma files as a template that basically is instructions on how to expect commenting to happen, where annotations will be and how to access them, and just other tips and tricks for navigating Figma files. But I don't have any specifics that I can share with you.
Addressing accessibility issues with this kind of system where you're doing annotations as well as kind of doing that hot potato between developers and designers?
Yeah, because we've only done this the one time, and that's not something that we have to consider between the two of us. Definitely not. I'm assuming you're not speaking about the actual work, because we definitely like do all the accessibility stuff on that side. Okay. Do you have any ideas?
I've seen different attempts at it online where people are documenting kind of how they do accessibility annotations in Figma, and so I'm just always curious if people are developing their own methods.
That sounds super cool. You should do that talk.
So with having a much better structure that matches what the developer is actually going to probably put into their code, are you guys thinking about next could be like automating some of that code?
Automating some of the code from Figma into our, I mean, I don't know what Figma's capable. During this project, I was kind of like, is Figma going to take my job? Because I was like, this is feeling really close to home. But, so I don't know, maybe, maybe. But I don't think we are going to be doing the automating, because I want a job still. But yeah, I don't know, we'll see.
All right, well, thanks to everyone for coming and listening. This was a lot of fun. Cheers.